What would you do if you lost all your money? Would you be brave enough to try and risk it by trying to win it through gambling? Did you know that the founder of FedEx once saved the company by taking its last $5,000 and turning it into $32,000 by gambling in Las Vegas? The man is Frederick W. Smith, who is the founder and current CEO of FedEx. In 1971, Smith took his personal fortune of around $4 million and raised around an additional $90 million to found a delivery company structured such that it could potentially deliver packages overnight to anywhere in the world. That is something that at the time had never been done. Smith had first outlined how such a company would operate in a 1962 paper he wrote while at Yale University. The paper was written for an economics class and was specifically on an overnight delivery service in a computer information age. Unfortunately, 3 years after the company began, largely thanks to rapidly rising fuel costs, Federal Express was on the verge of bankruptcy, losing over $1 million a month, with no one willing to give them any additional loans, nor any investors interested in contributing capital. At its low point, all the company had was $5,000 to its name, which wasn't even enough to continue operating as their planes needed fuel and that wouldn't cover it. Smith made a final pitch to General Dynamics for more funding, but it was refused, leaving FedEx more or less dead on the ground when they'd not be able to fuel their planes for the following Monday. It turns out a few days more was all he needed. Shortly thereafter, Smith successfully managed to raise $11 million to keep the company afloat, and by 1976, Federal Express made its first profit of $3.6 million. 4 years after that, the company's profits were up to nearly $40 million, with gross revenue near $500 million. Today, FedEx is estimated to be worth in the vicinity of 25 to 35 billion, with Smith himself currently worth around 2 billion. FedEx, the world's first overnight delivery company, delivers more than 1.2 billion packages every year to over 220 countries. Yet, in its early days, founder Frederick Smith was so desperate he had to rely on gambling in Vegas to fund his company. While majoring in economics at Yale University in 1962, Smith wrote a paper about the automation of society and the transportation of goods. At the time, shippers transported large packages by truck or passenger aeroplane, but Smith thought it would be more efficient to carry small, essential items by plane. Smith wrote the paper at the very last minute, just before it was due, and when asked about the results, he admitted, "I don't know what grade. Probably my usual C." Yet this paper became the backbone of FedEx. In 1971, Smith founded the company with $4 million of inheritance and $80 million of loans and equity investments. FedEx started out with 8 planes covering 35 cities, and it had plans to add more each month. But in the first 2 years, primarily due to rising fuel costs, the company found itself millions of dollars in debt and on the brink of bankruptcy. Even worse, Smith's vital pitch for funding to the General Dynamics board was rejected. The $95 million or so that was initially raised to found Federal Express is equivalent to around $500 million in today's money. Federal Express was later renamed FedEx in 1994. The company's express services, which used their fleet of planes, by 2000 became FedEx Express. Smith envisioned a company that could supply overnight deliveries from start to finish with its own depots, aeroplanes, posting stations, and delivery vans. His professor awarded him a C for the paper, noting although the concept was interesting and well formed, it simply wasn't feasible. The term paper conception doesn't end the fascinating story of FedEx's beginnings, however. In the early days of the company, Smith literally gambled it all and won. According to Smith, regardless of the professor's disbelief in his concept, he founded the company in the early 1970s, and in 1973, it shipped its first delivery of 186 packages. Soon though, it ran into serious financial difficulties. The 1970s were a time of rapidly inflating fuel costs, which were draining the young company's accounts. Within 3 years of its founding, FedEx was losing more than $1 million each month and verging on bankruptcy. Smith could not secure any more loans and investors were turning their backs on his young company. Smith reached a point when the company's account had only $5,000 and he couldn't afford to refuel the planes that delivered FedEx's shipments. After an unsuccessful pitch to General Dynamics FedEx for additional funds, the company was at the point of closing if it could not refuel the planes the following Monday. Still, Smith refused to surrender. He took the last $5,000 and flew to Vegas, placed the company's remaining money on blackjack bets over the weekend, and won an additional $27,000 by Monday. It wasn't a huge windfall, but the total $32,000 was enough to refuel the planes and keep the business running for a few more days. Those next few days were all FedEx needed to turn things around. Soon, Smith raised an additional $11 million, and by 1976, the company's profits reached $3.6 million. By 1980, FedEx's profits reached almost $40 million. Today, the shipping juggernaut that transports as many as 17 million packages each day is valued at an estimated $25 to $35 billion, and Smith's net worth is $2 billion. Interestingly, since 2001, FedEx Express has handled all express mail and priority mail for the US Postal Service. Their current contract for that ends in 2023. While in college, Frederick Smith was a member of the same fraternity as George W. Bush and was also a member of the Skull and Bones Society. Bush and he became friends in college, which subsequently led to Bush offering him the position of Defense Secretary in his administration, which Smith would ultimately turn down twice, once due to his own health and the second time during Bush's second administration due to Smith's terminally ill daughter. When FedEx's funds dwindled to just $5,000, Smith realized he didn't have enough to fuel the planes. The company had already gone to many extremes, from pilots using their own personal credit cards to fuel the planes to uncashed paychecks. Smith also served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam in the Marines, earning a Silver Star, a Bronze Star, and 2 Purple Hearts, eventually being discharged with the rank of captain in 1969. So what's a desperate founder to do? Smith impulsively flew to Las Vegas and played blackjack with the last of the company's money. Amazingly, when he came back the next week, he'd turned the remaining $5,000 into $27,000, just enough for the company to stay in operation for another week. In the book, Changing How the World Does Business, FedEx's incredible journey to success, the inside story, Roger Frock, a former senior vice president of operations at FedEx, describes the scene when he found out what Smith did. I said, "You mean you took our last $5,000? How could you do that?" Smith shrugged his shoulders and said, "What difference does it make? Without the funds for the fuel companies, we couldn't have flown anyway." The $27,000 wasn't the solution to all their problems, but Smith viewed it as a hopeful sign that things would go up from there. He used the money as motivation to obtain more funding and eventually raised another $11 million. After stabilizing financially, Smith helped launch a direct mail advertising campaign to boost the company's visibility. In 1976, FedEx produced its first profit of $3.6 million. A few years later, it went public and has been thriving ever since. Changing How the World Does Business is a book about the history of FedEx by Roger Frock. Frock was one of the founding executives of the company. On page 101 of the book, Frock says, "By mid-July, our funds were so meager that on Friday we were down to about $5,000 in the checking account, while we needed $24,000 for the jet fuel payment. When I arrived back in Memphis on Monday morning, much to my surprise, the bank balance stood at nearly $32,000. I asked Fred where the funds had come from, and he responded, "The meeting with the General Dynamics board was a bust, and I knew we needed the money for Monday, so I took a plane to Las Vegas and won $27,000. I said, "You mean you took our last $5,000? How could you do that?" He shrugged his shoulders and said, "What difference does it make? Without the funds for the fuel companies, we couldn't have flown anyway." Fred's luck held again. It was not much, but it came at a critical time and kept us in business for another week. Interestingly, FedEx isn't the only company partially funded by blackjack winnings. Bill Gross, founder of PIMCO, also used gambling to fund his investments. Since the harrowing effort, FedEx is on much firmer ground. In the last fiscal year, FedEx's 146,000 worldwide employees have helped earn the company $26.5 billion of revenue. In the future, FedEx plans to boost profits by nearly $2 billion via a series of cost-cutting measures, the Jackson Sun reports. Smith also recounted the story of Charlie Rose in 2008, but the FedEx founder and CEO isn't the only one who's benefited his business by playing blackjack. PIMCO founder Bill Gross credited much of his investment success to his early days spent playing the casino game, according to CNN Money. "I proved that the system could work. You could apply your mathematical prowesses in a card-counting way to beat the system, so to speak," he said. Meanwhile, the US Postal Service isn't doing so hot, announcing last week that it will need to raise postage rates next year by 1 cent, according to the Washington Post. The Postal Service is now losing billions of dollars every year.